If you're a React developer who uses forms, you're in for a treat with React 19. React 19 has introduced a new feature called Actions, which makes it much easier to handle forms, add loading states, and get the data out of a form. Let's explore how this works with a code example to understand what are actions and how to use them in your project. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Shruti Kapoor, and I'm on a mission to make you the best developer you're meant to be. In this video, we're going to convert a form from React 18 to React 19. And through that, we'll talk about what are React actions and understand why React actions are helpful and how can we hook up a form with the React action. We'll also look at two hooks, useActionState, useFormStatus, and see why they are helpful and how they can be used in submitting a form and getting data back from form. So if you're ready, let's get started. Now here on the right side, I have a simple form where if I enter my name, it shows me the data that was just typed in. And if I click on update, it submits the form, shows a loader screen, and disables the button while it is submitting the form. So this is a very simple form, but it shows three important things that are found in every form, which is input fields, data that is reflected back in the UI, and a loading state. The loading state is shown in the text as well as respected by the button itself. Even though this form only has one field and it's a very simple form, it can still be useful in understanding how forms can be converted from React 18 to React 19. Let's take a look at what the code for this form looks like. We have a simple form element. We have one input field that has an onChange event to it, handle change, which stores the data in the sets variable, and we're just setting the name to the value that was passed in the input field. Then we have a loader component here. This is where we check if the data is pending. Then we show a loading state. Otherwise, we just say hello in React 18 and the name that was submitted. Then to submit the form, we have a button with a disabled state, which is pending, same as the loading state. So the is pending state is respected by the button. And we have an onClick function, which is what submits the form. So in this handle submit function, which is what is submitting the form, we are first setting the pending state to true. Then we are calling our API. This is our fake API. And then once we've done calling our API, we are setting the is pending to false. So you can imagine that in your form, this is the place where you would call your API. And then you would set the is pending to false. So this is how we handle forms today and how we show loading states today. We have an is pending method. We manually set our is pending to true. We have a handle submit function where we update the is pending to true and false as needed. Now let's convert this form into React 19 and understand where actions can be helpful. In React 18, a new hook was introduced called useTransition. We're going to use that hook to understand how to create a pending state. So if you remember, useTransition hook gives back two variables, is pending and start transition function. If you don't remember useTransition hook, let me give a quick recap. useTransition hook was introduced in React 18 to mark certain updates as urgent. What does urgent mean? It tells React to prioritize certain updates over other updates. So the way this works is you call the useTransition hook and you mark non-urgent updates with start transition. And you put your non-urgent updates here. If you want to understand useTransition and start transition hooks, I'll have a video of these hooks linked in the description. So essentially what you need to remember is that we can use the useTransition hook to mark certain updates as non-urgent. And why this is helpful is because it automatically comes back with the is pending. And so is pending is set to true or false automatically by the start transition function. And so this is super helpful in our case because now we're going to use the start transition hook inside our handle submit and move all of these functions inside the start transition. And because this is an async function, since it's a timeout, I'm going to add async here. Now what's helpful is that I don't need to call set is pending anymore and I don't need to set it to false anymore because start transition will automatically take care of setting is pending to true and false. So now I can remove my use state that I was previously using to manually update is pending. Now what changed here? We added a start transition function. We call the useTransition hook. We use that start transition to mark this update as non-urgent. And what this gives us is that is pending is automatically set to true and false whenever this is being called. And how this helps us is that is pending will be set to true before the set timeout, and after the set timeout is called, it will automatically be updated to false. So we don't have to manually keep track of it anymore. We added an async function within the start transition. This is called an action. So simply speaking, actions are asynchronous functions. Actions are actually not new or unique to React 19. They have been around for a while. They are also found in other frameworks such as Remix. But in the context of React, all you need to remember is that React actions are asynchronous functions. And anything that was previously using is pending is still going to work. Let's also make sure that we have updated everything that says 18 to 19. Now there's an error in our form. Let's make sure what that is. Oh, useTransition needs to come from here. There we go. Cool. And if I submit this, and if I click on update, it still seems to work. It's actually not submitting the form, but that's okay. Let's fix it. Okay, so we created a start transition, and then we still have an on-click function here. With React 19, like we said, we don't need to submit a form using onClick anymore. We don't have to create a handle submit function anymore. So this can now be removed. And instead, we can now hook up our form with an action. And this action can have any name. It can be any function. So let's call it submit form action. What it really is this function that we created right here. So let's clean this up a little and move it to a new function. Let's create a new file. Okay, so we've hooked up our form with the submit form action using the action attribute. Now, when we submit the form, let's see what data gets back from the form. So let's say I write my name, Shruti, update, and in my actions, I want to see what data is coming to this action. So one thing that we haven't added so far is the parameters that this action accepts. It accepts previous state and form data. This automatically gets passed into submit form action through this action. So we can actually log the data that comes from the form in this function, which means that if I have an input value here, that input data will be in the form data object. Now this form data object is a form data object, which means we cannot do simple like form data dot property or like dot name. We'll have to do form data dot get name of the property. So here I'm going to call form data dot get name to see what data comes back from the input value. And I just want to make sure that the name of this input value is in fact name, which it is. In fact, this is kind of confusing. So why don't we change the name to input name? And I'll change this to input name as well, just so it's clear that this is the same input. Okay, now let me add some value here and see what I get back. Okay, my value is undefined. And that's happening because if I console log form data itself, form data is also undefined. And the reason that's happening is because we cannot hook up this action directly here. We actually need to use a new hook here called useActionState. And this is where we pass in this form action. And we can also pass an initial state. So I'm going to pass initial state as name. This useActionState will give back two variables, the state and form action. And now this is the form action that can be used to hook up here. Why this is so, why there is an extra step with useActionState, I don't really know, but I'll find out the reason. I'll keep you posted. But for now, just know that to wire up an action, we actually need to call the useActionState, which returns a form action, which is what we're going to submit here. Okay, so now in my action, if I log form data.get property, I should get the value that was submitted. So if I write Shruti, clear this out and click update, there you go. I've got the data coming back. Awesome. So this is how I can get the data that was submitted to the form. And you can imagine if there's multiple fields here, this can also easily expand to get different fields. Cool. Now that I have this data getting passed, what I want to do is that display this value here. As of now, I'm still using a set state. I don't need this anymore because I want to make sure that the data that I'm displaying here is the value that was submitted to the form. So here I'm saying hello in React 19 and I've got name. Let's make sure that the name is actually coming from the form. So I've got a state variable here, which we haven't used so far, but this is how I can get the name back. So I'll do state.name. And I also want to make sure that I'm actually returning this value as well. So I'll just return the data that was form data.getInputName, and I'll make sure that I'm returning the name. Now, I'm not using the previous state here. However, we can totally use that as well. So let's return previous state.name. Let's make sure that I don't have anything that I'm not using, which is handle change. I don't need this anymore. And I'm also going to remove my handle change function from here. Cool. So what did I do so far? I'm getting the data out of the state instead of picking it up from a set state, which means that this is going to be the information that was submitted to the form. So let's clear this out. Shruti K, update. It has a state with the name Shruti K. Oh, and my name is here. Perfect. Cool. So that's working. Sweet. So this is how we hooked up a form action to a form, removed the handle submit function from button, removed the set state from the input so that the data that was coming back that I was displaying on the screen was actually the data that was submitted to the form. So it's not coming from a state variable. So that means that this data is accurate depending on what was submitted to the form. The form action is now hooked up and we don't need a handle submit anymore. Cool. There's one last thing we'll look at, which is how to show loading states in React 19. Because right now, if you see, if I submit my form, I actually don't have that loading state anymore because isPending is never set to true. So let's do that right now. Now, we talked about the useActionState hook, but there's a new hook called useFormStatus, and it's really helpful because it gives us back the pending variable, which can be used to show the loading state. It also gives us back data, which is the data that was submitted to the form, and the action that is part of the form, which we used as part of useActionState. So this can be really helpful as well. Now we're going to use this useFormStatus to create loading states. One caveat though of useFormStatus is that it can only be used in child components. So in order to use useFormStatus, we actually need to create a child component where we can call this useFormStatus. So if you see, we have two places where we're using isPending. We have the loader itself, and then we have the button where we're disabling. Let's create a new component called loader, and I'm going to move this out here, and I'm going to call this function here, loader, and in this function, I'm going to call my hook useFormStatus, which gives me back the pending attribute, which gives me back the pending variable, which is what I need to show my hook. So now I'll say return if pending show loading. And because this component is a child of the form component, I don't need to pass anything because useFormStatus knows to get this data from the parent form. So I don't need to pass in anything to it. I think this useFormStatus can involve a bit of understanding because you need to understand that you need to create a child component within the form itself. So how we used to do before, where we just add an isPending variable, that's not going to work. So if I was to do that here, this wouldn't work. Okay, so we've got the isPending going. Let's get rid of this. Let's also move this into its own function, into its own component as well. And I'm going to create a new component here called display render name. This component just accepts name and returns the name. Now I'm going to call this render name here. And same with the button. Let's refactor this out into its own component called submit button. And all it needs is a form status similar to above. That's it. And this will be returning this. I'm missing half the button. Perfect. And now I'll just call the submit button here. Sweet. So my form overall looks a lot more cleaner with this. I could do the same for input as well, but let's leave that for now. Now, one thing that I'm not passing into the render name component is the name itself. So let's pass that now. Name is equal to state dot name. Reload that component. Let's see what issues there are. useFormStatus is not defined. Let's define that here. Let's remove the things that we don't need. Okay, what else? useFormStatus is not a function at loader. So looks like something is breaking here. useFormStatus is not a function at loader. Oh, it's because we are using useFormStatus from React. In fact, it comes from React DOM. So let's do that. Okay, reload this. Objects are not valid as child. Let's fix this. There you go. Cool. So now if I do Shruti, I should see a loader. There you go. Cool. And I also want to make sure that I am only rendering the name if there is no pending state. So I can check this. If pending state is not available, then render the name. If no pending, then okay, Shruti Sweet. Perfect. And so, as you saw, we are using useFormStatus hook, useActionState, and the form action itself in this React 19 form. So let's recap what we changed. Let me put the React 18 form up here. Now, in React 18 form, we had a handle submit function, which is how we submitted the form, attaching it to an on-click handler of the form. To set the is pending states, we were actually using use states and manually setting them before we were calling the API and then setting it to false after the API was called. To show data that was submitted, we were actually setting it within the state itself and then just updating that value on change and then showing that value. So it wasn't exactly the data that was submitted to the form. With React 19, the way this changes is that instead of submitting the form using a handle click, we actually have an action. This form action comes from the hook useActionState. We can actually also write an action inline, but here we have a useActionState. This is a new hook introduced in React 19. It gives us back the state, which is how we know the data that was submitted to the form, in our case name. And it also gives back a form action, which is how we hook up the form. To get loader states, we can use a hook called useFormStatus. This hook only works within child components of the form. So we created a child component called loader, render name, and submit button. So we could use useFormStatus hook in here. And that's how to go from React 18 form to a React 19 form. I hope this video was helpful to understand actions, useFormStatus, and useActionState. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.